Hello! I am recording this video on January 10th. Magic Online is currently experiencing some client, probably server-side issues, and lag while playing games is pretty bad right now. So today, rather than record a gameplay video, I thought it would be a good use of my time to record a really thorough breakdown of current Legacy, letting you know what you need to be thinking about, what are the tech in these decks, what are the flex slots in these decks. So today is going to be kind of like a lot of deck techs, a lot of technical information, and let me know your honest feedback on this for whether you'd like to see this again on the channel. All right, here we go. Hello folks, Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU here for a detailed breakdown of Legacy. Want to do a couple of things real quick before I get going. First, I want to thank Edison for giving me a dealer's choice donation deck list. I'm going to use that to fund the creation of this video. Next, so that I don't have to interrupt this video process, let me just plug my sponsors real quick. Huge shout outs to toamagic.com for always supporting my content. Promo code ThrabenU will save you 5% on your order. And if you're going to an upcoming big event such as MagicCon Chicago, please consider placing an order in advance and picking it up on site. It is super, super convenient. And let me say, if you are interested in any of my deck lists, all of my stuff is always going to be available on my moxfield.com profile. And I'm going to show off a Moxfield tool today during the video, so that's probably enough of a shout out to them. They're great. Use their stuff. With that being said, let's start by taking a quick look at the Legacy metagame. This is something that I have done in my most recent episode of the Eternal Glory podcast. So if you want that a little more in-depth than what I'm going to do here, consider checking out that episode. All right, so I want to look at the metagame on two different websites here because they tell slightly different stories here. So this is MTG Goldfish, and I think about the top 10 decks here are usually what's worth looking at in terms of metagame percentage and popularity. So the most popular deck, according to MTG Goldfish right now, is Red Stompy at about 13%. We have a decent amount of tempo in the metagame between Temur Delver, which is really a blue-red base right now, with Questing Druid / Seek the Beast being the green that's in there, as well as Dimir Tempo, Blue-Black Delver, Dimir Delver, whatever you want to call that. Dimir Reanimator is still in a major position at about 8%, and from there we see a decent amount of combo rounding out the metagame. Oops All Spells, Cephalid Breakfast, Sneak and Show, Painter, and then the Nadu mid-range combo deck that a lot of times you will refer to as like a Bant Nadu deck. If you compare this to the numbers that you are going to see over on MTG Top 8, the numbers tell a similar story. Some of the specifics are a little bit different. So for example, Dragon Stompy is listed as a smaller part of the metagame on this website. But the thing that I find most useful at a glance is these just aggregate numbers. The aggro / tempo decks are about 40% of the format. The control decks are about 15%. The combo decks are about 50% of the format. So when you are thinking about Legacy right now overall, in your average rounds, you should not be expecting to play against control. You should be expecting to be playing against a deck that can pressure you quickly, be that through a combo finish or through aggressively attacking your life total and other resources such as lands. Current Legacy is incredibly proactive. Current Legacy is quite fast, maybe not quite as fast as the pre-banning format, as losing Psychic Frog and losing Vexing Bauble did depower some decks, but overall, the format itself is fast and proactive. You are trying to settle in for long games, you are probably going to have a bad time. That doesn't mean you can't do it, but you have a lot of things you need to worry about right now. You have to worry about sowing Mycospawn, obliterating one or more of your lands when it is cast. you have to worry about Blood Moon. You have to worry about Harbinger of the Seas. You have to worry about Magus of the Moon. So if you are trying to play a multicolor control deck, the Wastelands and sort of land hating haymakers that are in the format right now are going to make that really, really hard. And it is a little tough to deal with combo at the same time as you are respecting these fast aggro decks that can play haymakers that if they are not immediately answered, they will just kill you. So what I'd like to do from here is start by talking about a couple of the top decks and breaking them down in a little bit more detail than we did on the podcast itself. So the first deck that I want to talk about is Dimir Tempo, Blue Black Delver, kind of however you want to think about it. And the reason that I want to start here is because in my experience, it is relatively difficult to know exactly what this deck is going to look like. So I have pulled two challenge results from recently. I believe one by Kentaro Hikori and the other by Okeanos Solus or something like that. And the big thing that I want to point out here is that there is a 12 card difference between these. And for a main deck of the same archetype, that's a lot. Now, a couple of these differences are very minor. You know, swamp and island versus swamp, no covered swamps, no covered island, that's not that big of a deal. But some of these might have Thoughtseizes, some of these might have Hymn to Turok, some of these might have Fatal Push, some of these might have Dismember, some of these might have Snuff Out. There might be some number of artifacts, including main deck graveyard hate, that you have to contend with. Some of these decks are going to be trying to grind more value. Some of these decks are going to be playing more copies of Brazen Borrower. The Dimir Tempo deck, as it's currently constructed, has, overall the same core. You are going to be killing people with your Murktide Regents, your Bowmasters, your Nethergoyfs. But there is a lot of difference right now in the exact numbers that these decks are going to be running. If you are a tournament-minded player, what I recommend doing is a day or two before your tournament, whenever you're sitting down to finalize your exact sideboard, do what I'm doing right here. This is Moxfield.com's compare feature. Just upload 2 deck lists that you want to compare, or more, to Moxfield, and just compare them to each other and see what are people playing right now today. Because the numbers are fluctuating a lot. And knowing whether you are facing down 1 Brazen Borrower or 3 Brazen Borrowers is a really big difference in terms of your opponent's number of outs, especially to the Haymaker game-ending cards that you might be slamming, like, say, a Magus of the Moon. Okay, bad example. Let's use Blood Moon instead. Your opponent has 1 Brazen Borrower, well, then a lot of their lands are probably shut off for the rest of the game. If they have 3, your Blood Moon might only last a couple of turns before your opponent gets out from under that, fetches their swamp, and then it's not that big of a deal if it comes down again. Sorry, it was Ocean Soul 92. Okay, as we go into more and more of these Dimir Tempo deck lists, there's just so much fluctuation right now in what they are doing. You might see Go for the Throat or Shoot the Sheriff in these flex slots beyond what I have already told you. You may see more copies of some of these things. You may see Barrogoyf in game 1. It is not uncommon for these current Dimir Tempo decks to be playing a couple of 3-drops in the main deck. The Goyfs are really good. They appear in a lot of the deck lists, either in the main deck or the sideboard. Counting it as an honorary 3-drop, Kaito Bane of Nightmares is showing up a decent amount. This is a card that has showed up in Legacy a fair amount. Oh, that is not super readable. Okay, but this is fine. So you should expect this to be ninjutsu'd in more often than it is hardcast. And when it gets ninjutsu'd in, or more accurately, during your turn, he's a 3/4 ninja creature with hexproof, so a little annoying to answer immediately. So a lot of times what will happen is your opponent will bounce some cheap creature, a Bowmaster or a Tameo, put this in, immediately surveil to draw a card because Kaito did damage to you, and then can start plussing to grow itself later or go into a more defensive mode. This is perhaps not the ideal legacy card. It is pyroblastable on your own turn, but having, X-proof for half of the game is perfectly fine. Being able to reuse Bowmaster triggers is perfectly fine. Sometimes you can just junk an Orcish Bowmaster token if you don't need it to get this into play. This is something that can be powerful and can take over a game. As far as the sideboards go, the biggest things that are on my mind playing against this deck are, in post-sideboard games, I really need to be respecting Harbinger of the Seas, because this is something that can just be pseudo game ending on the spot if you are not prepared for it, or hardly noticeable if you know that it is coming. When I am thinking about these Dimir Tempo sideboards right now, Harbinger of the Seas and Consigned to Memories, like those are the cards that I think are just like always, always, always going to be there. And then beyond that, you're going to see some amount of Graveyard Hate and additional disruption. Sometimes it's Grafdigger's Cage. Sometimes you'll see Nihil Spellbombs if they are not in the main deck. Sometimes you'll see Unlicensed Hearse. And sometimes you will see Ghost Vacuum. We are not at the point where there is a solidified Delver list or Blue-Black Tempo list that has like, okay, there's 3 or 4 flex slots in the 75. We are not there yet as far as the metagame goes. So when you are playing against this deck, I recommend thinking, what are the things that should be on my radar? And there are going to be more things that should be on your radar than are in the deck. If you have a very long game 1, you might be able to go, okay, if they have this, it probably means that they also have that. Or you might be able to get a read on whether or not they are like going all in on fatal pushes, or whether they have a mix of removal spells, and that might slightly adjust your game plan as you are going into other games. In contrast, why don't we look at Temur Delver now? Which is basically blue-red Delver, again, that just has Questing Druid in it. Seek the Beast is a really good card advantage engine. It's no expressive iteration or dig through time, but it's quite solid. And it just comes attached to another body as well. If you have never played against Questing Druid, the general play pattern tends to be, at your end step, your opponent will cast Seek the Beast, and they can play those until their next end step. Meaning they can Questing Druid and then deploy the lands or creatures or whatever that are going to be revealed off of this instant. And then they can Questing Druid scale up from there. This doesn't get big quite as quickly as Murktide Regent, but if you are kind of in a board stall sort of game, Questing Druid will do a lot of work, as every time you cast a cantrip, it just naturally scales up. Be careful about your timing of spells if you are playing against Questing Druid, as if you cast something in your pre-combat main phase and your opponent counters it, your Questing Druid is then 1 larger for the combat step, which might mean that you take your attacks. Let me rephrase that. Which might mean that your attacks become worse or less advantageous. These decks are much closer to being solved and configured for the current metagame. They are almost always either a 14 or 15 creature deck, with the big difference being, maybe 1 Brazen Borrower or 1 Questing Druid away from each other. The core of this deck is very, very solved, and it tends to be either like a counter spell or a removal spell that flexes between them. So for example, here we see Unholy Heat and Force of Negation. Here we see 2 Unholy Heats, no Force of Negation. Here we see a Preordain, probably to add another sorcery to the deck for DRC, and a main deck Pyroblast. And here we see 2 Chain Lightnings, as well as 1 Preordain. So the core of this deck is very consistent. You might know, oh, I need to play around roughly 5 to 6 removal spells in the deck total, and maybe a Brazen Borrower effect or two. But there are not going to be surprises out of this deck in game 1. There's two things that I want to draw attention to in the sideboards of these decks. Number one is counterbalance. Roughly 50% of the Temur Delver decks have counterbalance in the sideboard. It is not a required thing. 2 of the 4 decks that I have pulled up right now have them. If you are a combo player, you might, and like counterbalance is going to be heavily detrimental to you. Just keep this in mind. The other card that I really want to call out here is Price of Progress. Price of Progress is the sort of thing that can take you from a game that you can never lose to a game that you instantly lose. So if you know you have control of the game, you know that you are going to win the game, and you have more non-basic lands in your hand, consider whether or not you actually need to play them, because Price of Progress is a hell of a drug, and I know that I have played enough land-based strategies on this channel that just took 20 or very close to it from a Price of Progress to know to be wary of this. Last thing of note here, and this one is targeted at the artifact players in particular. A few weeks ago, Meltdown was normally seen as a, 2 or 3 of in a lot of decks that look like this. And now Meltdown is floating into the this card is optional territory very, very quickly. Roughly half of the decks are going to end up having Meltdown in their sideboard. So while Meltdown is something that should be on your radar, it is not necessarily something that you have to be in absolute fear of. Consigned to memory, still going to be there. Some amount of graveyard hate, still going to be there. Meltdown? Maybe. So next I want to talk about Eldrazi. I'm going to quickly reiterate something that we covered on the last episode of the Eternal Glory podcast. And that is Eldrazi's very weird place in the current metagame. In some ways, current Legacy is built around Eldrazi. There are a lot of decks that are playing things like Harbinger of the Seas and Blood Moons and Magus of the Moons that hate on Eldrazi's non-basic mana base. And some decks like Painter and play a Painter Servant, and then all of a sudden a bunch of your Eldrazi cards have colors, and some of your stuff just, frankly, stops working. With a great example of that being It That Heralds the End. If all of your cards all of a sudden have a color, then guess what? You're not getting that cost reduction anymore. And more importantly, Eldrazi Temple gives you mana that you can use to cast colorless Eldrazi spells, and that gets shut off too. So a bunch of the top decks of Legacy right now have a good Eldrazi matchup, or maybe don't care about Sowing Mycospawn, obliterating 2 of their lands at the same time, or can win before the Eldrazi deck comes online. There's a much better and longer explanation of this on the pod, but I'll leave that to you if you want to listen to that. As far as the deck itself, you should be expecting 25 lands. That is a really, really solid stock number amongst all of the various Eldrazi decks running around right now. But there is a little bit of flex in terms of what the last couple of lands are going to be. So for example, some of them will be playing Gaia's Cradle, as that allows you to do very silly things with a Kozilek's command. But that's not necessarily going to be there in all of them. Some things that should be on your radar are Blast Zone, Basic Wastes, City of Traders is probably about in half of these. Maze of Ith is in some of them. The weirdo that I have not seen in games yet, but came up on the podcast, was Abstergo Entertainment. This is maybe unexciting for its mana producing abilities, but for 3 mana, you can exile this and tap it to return up to 1 target historic card from your graveyard to your hand, and then exile all graveyards. So when your opponent casts Sowing Mycospawn, this is just a thing that they can find. It is sort of like a Bojuka Bog that you can fire off whenever you need to, rather than the Bojuka Bog effect happening immediately. And in theory, this can return a historic card. This can get you back a Chalice or a Lotus Petal or even a copy of the One Ring in some cases. So this is going to be a high variance card, but when it is good, oh buddy, it is going to be scary. As far as main deck flex slots go, Grim Monolith is a really big one right now. So in a couple of different lists, you're going to see about 3 copies of Grim Monolith rounding out the main deck. There's oftentimes a range of like 17 to 19 creatures that you're going to see in these decks. And when the creature count is higher, it that heralds the end or null drifters tend to be the things that fill out the lists. Some of these builds that have the Grim Monoliths are playing fewer copies of Once Upon a Time, as you can see in this list as well. And then I think it's this one. When you have more copies of Once Upon a Time, you might not be seeing things like the One Ring that you see in the other deck lists. More deck lists than not are playing a couple copies of the One Ring, but this is not a One Ring deck where you are seeking to maximize your value on the One Ring by playing a couple of them. This is a deck that can just happen to produce a lot of mana and can benefit from the One Ring just being an objectively powerful card. Notably, many of these Eldrazi decks are playing 2 or 3 Null Rods in their sideboards, even though they are a One Ring Lotus Petal deck. Sometimes you just have to accept this hurts you more than it hurts me. As far as graveyard hate goes, you should expect Eldrazi to be playing Leyline of the Void. I believe that is one of the best graveyard hate cards in the current metagame. They are not always going to be doing that. Sometimes you might see some combo of like fairies and ghost vacuums instead, but I think Leyline is correct. And we'll talk about Oops All Spells in a couple of minutes, but Oops All Spells being as good as it is in Legacy right now is the strongest reason to be playing Leyline of the Void. Beyond that, the sideboards are kind of unimpressive. You should be expecting a couple of cards that can answer opposing permanents. Usually Dismember, Disruptor Flute, and Wayscape Battle Mage are going to be seen in some numbers. For the combo players out there, Mindbreak Trap is something that is in a lot of these deck lists, but it won't necessarily be in every single one. As a final note here for our Aggro/Tempo section, the couple of decks that I've talked about are like basically it right now. You will occasionally see someone in a Grixis Delver deck instead. If you want Lightning Bolt and Netherglyph at the same time, for example, that might be attractive. You will also occasionally see some blue-red tempo deck lists that have Dismember, but maybe not the actual black sources to cast them. But generally speaking, there are very few other fair creature-based decks in the format right now. You are going to run into Death and Taxes, and when you do, it will probably have a black splash like you'll see here for Overlord of the Balemark, maybe Orcish Bowmasters, maybe Thoughtseize in the main deck or sideboard, with Phantom Blade being another thing that is picking up quite a bit in popularity, as blinking that with your Yorion is kind of gross, and if you are cheating the mana cost of it with Stoneforge Mystic, it's relatively strong. But the Death and Taxes style decks right now end up having a pretty bad combo matchup, even if you dedicate a ton of your sideboard to beating combo. And there are very clearly some things targeted directly at Nadu combo here. But as far as like other creature-based decks, your goblins, your mavericks, your energy decks, those sorts of things are not putting up massive results right now. Okay, let's talk about Oops All Spells now. Generally speaking, in the history of Legacy, Oops All Spells has been an unimpressive deck. There are a handful of diehards who have constantly put up good results with Oops All Spells, but generally speaking, Oops All Spells has not been one of the best things to be doing in Legacy. And that has now changed. And Oops All Spells is probably about the second best combo deck in Legacy right now, with blue-black Reanimator probably being the best combo deck in Legacy. We did a very, very detailed breakdown of this deck on the Eternal Glory podcast, and Bryant did a really good job of talking about different builds of Oops All spells that are running around right now and the reason why they are different. So I'm not going to go too crazy on this deck here. Oxwalkers is one of the pieces of tech that has made this deck better. Oxwalkers does a couple of different things for the deck. Number one, it has made it much harder for a single Surgical Extraction or Fairy Macabre to just take out the deck. This deck, generally speaking, is trying to win by casting a Dread Return on a Thassa's Oracle. And it used to be, you have one Surgical, you have one Fairy, you can disrupt this and probably win the game. Now, between Poxwalkers and Memory's Journey, there's enough stuff there that's just not true anymore, and a single Surgical or Fairy probably doesn't get you a win versus a more experienced player. The issue is that Memory's Journey can go and put Lotus Petal, Thassa's Oracle right on top of your deck and represent a win very quickly, even if they don't have any starting mana sources. And the Jack-O-Lantern can be exiled from your graveyard to make that green mana, so one Spirit Guide, one mana source of any kind can make it so that your opponent can save their Thassa's Oracle from death. The secondary problem here is that sometimes, even if you manage to stop the Thassa's Oracle, your opponent can just Poxwalker's Cabal Therapy, Poxwalker's Cabal Therapy, Poxwalker's Cabal Therapy, Poxwalker's Dread Return, and end up creating a large number of creatures, zombie tokens specifically, with Bridge from Below, that can just kill you in an attack step or two. So even if they Memory's Journey 3 irrelevant cards to the top of their library, it may just be that they can produce roughly 10 power and kill you in 2 strikes. As far as the sideboard goes, the biggest thing that should be on your radar is Goblin Charbelcher. It is very common for the Oops All Spells sideboards to have like 4 Goblin Charbelchers, and this is their way to just beat Graveyard Hate if they are not otherwise answering your Leyline of the Void or whatever Graveyard Hate you are playing with something like Force of Vigor or Nature's Claim. Now, one line that I very specifically want to make sure is on your radar, because it fucking sucks, is Disciple of Freyalise. The Oops All Spells mana bases can be built in very different ways right now. You can make it pretty much mono black, where you have a bunch of the black MDFCs, and then you can start running Unmask, or you can be green heavier. If you become green heavier, you have Disciple of Freyalise. And while it looks like this card doesn't really do anything and it's just like a green card that you might pitch to Force of Vigor, in reality, this is a Dread Return target. So let's go back to a minute ago when I was talking about how you could put Lotus Petal, Thassa's Oracle on top of your deck. Now, that is something that you could win with over the course of 3 turns. But what if you just win right now? What if you Dread Return, Disciple of Freyalise, you sacrifice a Poxwalker, which conveniently has 3 power, you draw Lotus Petal, Thassa's Oracle. You're dead. Oops All Spells has gotten scarier, folks. This is a tier 1 deck that you need to respect. When you are building your sideboards for current Legacy, your Surgicals and Fairies are a lot worse than they used to be. And your Leyline of the Voids, your Rest in Pieces that just say no to the graveyard, those are much stronger than they were in the Psychic Frog metagame. Alright, let's talk about Reanimator. I'm not going to linger for too long on Reanimator. This is one of those things that I think most people who are in touch with Legacy kind of have a feel for what this deck looks like. So most of the time when we refer to Reanimator in current Legacy, we are referring to a blue-black Reanimator deck that looks something like this. They are clearly intending on being a Reanimator deck, but either in the main deck or the sideboard, there is some tempo plan in it as well, where creatures like Dalthy Voidwalker and Barrogoyf and Brazen Borrower and do the beatdown plan when you need to get that done. Looking at a secondary list here, you can kind of see that it is not as much of a split between tempo and Reanimator as it was in the Psychic Frog times, where it was like very balanced and it's like, in any given game I could go either way. This is trying to be a Reanimator deck first and a Tempo deck secondarily. The thing that I want to focus on here, though, is that there are other legacy Reanimator decks besides the very traditional, like, blue-black Tempo deck that we are looking at here. There is another mono-black or close to it Reanimator deck that exists as well. And this is trying to go up on disruption and go faster. So you see Dark Rituals in this deck, you see Unmasks in this deck, and you will sometimes see what I might call some spicier, some less common reanimation targets. You will almost always only see Archon of Cruelty and Atraxa out of the blue-black list, and of course the Troll of Khazad-dûm, because that is just a part of the mana base. But in some of these other faster, lower to the ground Reanimator decks, you will see other targets. Some of these decks might go into other colors. So here is another challenge result that had Faithless Looting and a light red splash to be able to throw the creatures that you draw into the graveyard. And again, from these lists, you do tend to see some of these spicier selections that you just do not see out of the traditional lists. A big fundamental difference between these two types of Reanimator decks is the Trolls. The Troll of Khazad-dûm, you don't tend to counter that effect, right? Like, your opponent pays a mana, they swamp cycle this, it's in the graveyard. Whereas in these mono black or close to it decks, they are looking to Entomb or Faithless Looting or Thoughtseize themselves to put that creature into the graveyard in the first place. So against these more all-in Reanimator decks that don't have the backup tempo plan, if you can cut off them getting the creature into the graveyard, you might leave some of these Exhumes and Animate Deads and Reanimates stuck in their hands. You might see Ripples of Undeath out of these decks. This is something that can just accidentally mill over some creatures. It can be a source of card advantage for them. But keep in mind, they are already using their life totals with things like Grizzlebrands and Thoughtseizes, so if you can pressure their life total, you can shut off Reanimates and Thoughtseizes and Ripples and such relatively well. The sideboards of these decks can vary quite a bit depending on what colors they're actually in. This version was Grixis, for example, so it has access to things ranging from Magus of the Moons to Show and Tells as alternative plans, whereas this one has some green in the lands so that it can do the Witherbloom Apprentice combo with Chain of Smog in the post-sideboard games. The thing that's shared between both of these deck lists is that there is a pivot plan of some kind in the sideboard because the deck doesn't naturally have that backup plan. You know, this deck can cast Brazen Borrowers and Bowmasters and Goyfs and Voidwalkers and just beat down, and these two decks need to fully pivot to dodge hate. Okay, next up I want to cover Nadu decks. Nadu was something that I personally thought was going to be a really, really big problem in the post-Psychic Frog banning world, as the Nadu deck didn't really get touched by the banning waves and was already quite good. And initially, we did see a lot of really good Nadu results, and the deck has kind of fallen into an acceptable range. I still think it is very toxic as far as play patterns go. I don't think it is fun to play against. I think it is a little bit hard to hate on. The metagame seems to be checking Nadu appropriately at this time, though. The Nadu decks fall into a couple of different categories and like clearly distinctive decks. With Cephalid Breakfast, that is Nadu combo that can also combo off with Cephalid Illusionist being the most popular way to build things right now. Perhaps the biggest piece of tech here that you might not be familiar with is the same Memories Journey that we were seeing out of Oops All Spells. So if you think that your opponent is just going to mill themselves and then you're going to interact with that Thassa's Oracle and stop it, and that is just going to be the game, that is not really the case here. Sort of frustratingly, when playing against this deck, the Cephalid Illusionist side of the deck and the Nadu side of the deck play out differently. So when you have something like a Nadu and a Nomad's Encore or a Shuko, a lot of times you can just draw draw cards until you have a couple of swords, prismatic endings, forces, dazes, and just bury your opponent in a fair capacity. Whereas the Cephalid Illusionist combo side of the deck is the turbo side of the deck, where you are just attempting to go for a win, and if it doesn't work, you can just try again in another turn. So if you can, in playing against Nadu, it is often more effective to try and shut off the nomads in core than it is to interact with the creatures directly, as your opponent has 8 of these effects, plus, depending on the builds, some number of cantrips or green sun zeniths to go and find these. So a lot of times, if you are just trying to interact with and stop the Nadus and the Cephalid Illusionists when they come down, your opponent will be better at finding more copies of that than you are at finding removal spells. So for example, if you are playing some blue deck that has roughly 6 removal spells, well, your opponent has these 8 baseline effects, plus their cantrips, their dig, their tutors beyond that, and they will be ever so slightly better at finding these things. Notably, if you have a counter spell, you might need to counter a Nomads in core in the early game, even if it's not all that attractive to do so, because Cavern of Souls into Nadu is a thing that exists and can happen, and your opponent might then force through that combo. You will occasionally even see more copies of Cavern of Souls in the sideboard to make that happen more consistently. Some of the more toolboxy decks that are playing things like Green Sun Zenith and Chord of Calling might require a slightly different approach than a Cephalid Breakfast deck or a more mid-range control-y Bant Nadu deck. From some of these, you might call it like Nadu Elves deck lists that play some number of mana dorks to accelerate out the combo. You might even see Shaman in core alongside Nomads in core. This is just so that you can have something with a different name, so that if your opponent plays something like a Pithing Needle or a Disruptor Flute, you still have something that you can tutor up with your Chord of Calling that can promote that combo win. While this specific build only has natural order for Crater Hoof, some of the other builds will have more copies of natural order, and then we'll throw something like an Atraxa in the mix as well. The Nadu decks are one of those things that, like, I have my eye on as, like, as the metagame shifts and respects it less, it will get better and better. This is one of those things that I expect to swing in and out of popularity in Legacy over the next few months. And the final thing that I want to do in this video is just quickly look at a bunch of other combo decks and say some quick notes about them. Because the metagame is roughly 50% combo. It fluctuates a little bit from day to day, but we have been sitting at about 50% combo for quite some time. Not every combo deck, but a lot of combo decks right now are using the graveyard in some capacity. Be that for a primary part of the combo, like Cephalid Breakfast, Reanimator, or Oops All Spells, or for some graveyard-oriented value, like you might see Painter decks doing things with Goblin Welders and Goblin Engineers. You might see Storm decks using their graveyard for, a Past in Flames or Beseech the Mirror line. And occasionally there will be other graveyard-oriented combos as well. Someone's always going to be out there playing Dredge. I'm going to quickly highlight 3 specific combo decks that I have something to say about. Number 1, Show and Tell decks. When you are playing against current Show and Tell decks, please keep the One Ring in mind as something that you need to expect. A lot of times previously, if you could stop the initial Show and Tell or Sneak Attack, depending on what exactly the variety of build your opponent was playing, you would kind of have inevitability over your opponent, as a lot of times the Show and Tell deck was very good at going off with one layer of protection, and if you went bam bam and stopped both of those things, you would win. Well, now you also need to clock them, because the One Ring is fucking scary. And you might have control of the game after you stop their initial combo burst, but if you cannot finish the game, the One Ring will probably end up burying you. So when you can, try to pressure this deck. It is not enough to just fight them off on the stack anymore because of how good the One Ring and B. Also keep in mind that this deck is another Harbinger of the Seas deck out of the sideboard. There are plenty of other viable, fast combo decks, such as Doomsday, that can do something strong with some degree of protection as well. I want to highlight Doomsday here, mostly for the inexperienced players. In Game 1, Doomsday, not really so much a creature deck, right? But be aware that it is not uncommon for Doomsday in the post-sideboard games to play something like Shoulder the Apocalypse that they can Dark Ritual into. And if you have boarded out all of your removal spells because you are not expecting Doomsday to have creatures because they didn't in Game 1, this is something that can absolutely get you, especially if you are naturally a deck with Ponders and Brainstorms or the One Ring. This is something that even occasionally catches me as I am, playing some deck for the first time and I don't have a solidified sideboard plan in mind. Sometimes I'll be winging it, and this is something that can just get you. And the final deck that I want to shout out is the Mystic Forge combo deck list. This is a deck that got hit pretty hard by the banning of Vexing Bauble because it is relatively reliant on resolving a 4-drop Haymaker of some kind so that it can win the game. There are other paths to victory, such as Glaring Fleshraker plus Kozilek's Command, but it used to be that your opponent would have to interact with Vexing Bauble and then interact with your 4-drop. And that was really tough to do. That would require something like a Force of Will on turn 1 into a Consign to Memory on turn 2 or something like that. And now that you have to have multiple Haymakers in order to have successful hands, and now that you can't just play Urza's Saga and wait for Vexing Bauble if your opponent isn't pressuring your life total, this deck has gotten worse against blue decks specifically. Now, the non-blue decks might still struggle against this one, as it is still quite consistent if you are not interacting against it. But now that the blue decks get to use their counterspells to do their thing again, this deck has fallen completely into fair territory. A side effect of Vexing Bauble being banned is that Force of Vigor was another really good way to interact with most of these artifacts, and that now has been unchecked as well. Alright, so I think that's my legacy knowledge drop for today. Hopefully that gave you a feel for what to expect from various decks, where the metagame is at, things that should be on your radar. Really and truly, get in the comments down below. Let me know what you thought of this one. These videos are hit or miss in terms of analytics, so knowing whether or not people actually want to watch these is really useful for me. Alright, have a great rest of the day, folks. See ya.